Welcome back, everyone. Today is June 8th, and joining us once again is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Colonel, it's great to have you back. The Middle East has once again been shaken by a new round of confrontation between Israel and Iran. Missiles have been launched, airstrikes have been carried out, and despite calls for restraint, tensions remain extremely high. Some analysts argue that Israel has strengthened its position. Others believe the latest escalation has exposed new vulnerabilities and complicated its strategic goals. What's your assessment of where things stand today?
So the American people will not see any effects of this in real time.
So let me ask you this. What do you see as the wider future of Israel? It seems that certain policies, including Section 224, may be giving it a kind of temporary lease on life. But at the same time, the strategic picture is becoming more complicated. We're seeing Iran extending its deterrence not only toward Lebanon, but also Gaza and the wider Palestinian arena. And Israel's broader regional posture is also raising questions, including its relationships with countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, even if those tensions haven't fully escalated yet. So when you put all of these factors together, where do you think this is ultimately heading? And what does the future of Israel look like in this kind of environment?
I think, I've said for some time, I gave a talk at the National Press Club in 2016, I think it was, and I titled the talk, "Is Israel a strategic asset or a strategic liability?" And I came down hard on the latter. I even resurrected the Joint Staff and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff report for George Marshall on the situation in 48. And of course, the recommendation to Harry Truman was, don't do this. Don't recognize Israel when they stand up. And if you can, and you go back a little bit further, don't go for the petition. This is the British trying to lure us into taking over their responsibilities and thereby restoring their imperial interest through us. It was a very good report, and almost everything predicted in that report has come true. It's very difficult anymore with the Cold War having ended and not needing an unsinkable aircraft carrier, as it were, at the end of the Mediterranean. Very difficult to even justify why Israel and the United States have a relationship. Extremely difficult when you divorce the Holocaust from the considerations. And I don't know anyone with any logic, sentient nature that could say that a duplication of the Holocaust is not now created in Gaza and environs by the people who went through the original one. I mean, that's just a reality, I think. And yet, we can't seem to back away from that. Now, as I was doing my research for the is Israel a strategic or a liability or asset, I had to go through and look closely at the Cold War years and maybe come up with an idea, based on strategic realities, that as long as we thought the Soviet Union was the danger that they were, as long as we thought Nasser was a danger, for example, with his United Arab Republic, as long as we thought Egypt was pre-Sadat a problem, maybe Israel was somewhat of a strategic asset. I even had my doubts then, though, because of what the Joint Staff report said about basically 400 million Arabs and whatever number of Jews there were at that time. It doesn't compute. It really showed a hangover British hatred, disgust, whatever you want to call it, for the Arabs. That's what it showed. And the fact that, as Moshe Dayan said after the 67 war, apocryphal or not, it was like Moshe Dayan. When someone asked him, how did you win that war so fast? He said, well, it helps to be fighting Arabs. That kind of disdain has been there and is still there. So if you look at it really closely now, though, and you think about what the United States ought to be doing in this time of post-Cold War upheaval and a shift of power from the West to the East that's dramatic, It's very difficult to justify us even being in Southwest Asia, in my view. Very difficult to justify. As Iran has shown with its control over the Strait of Hormuz and our inability to really contest that control, that's the real arbiter of that strait that Jimmy Carter in 1978 said was absolutely essential to U.S. national security. Open parentheses, he really meant to Japan's and others, because even at that time, it wasn't really essential to our security, but it's certainly essential to some of our allies' security. But that said, that's no longer the case. And Iran has put a period to that being no longer the case. Why can't you get along with Iran ultimately? Why can't you negotiate an end to this war? Why can't you come to some kind of conclusion that would deal with what is the real problem here, Palestine? Well, you can't because of that liability. I mean, that's what we're doing. That's what we're proving. So the first thing you need to do is change that liability to either neutral or an asset. Anybody think Donald Trump has the finesse and the capabilities and the diplomatic skills and all the rest that goes along with it to do that? No. So we're stuck. We're stuck, and we're stuck at a time when our domestic situation is looking fraught and deadly as well. So I have to conclude that this shift of power, as it were, in the world is going to go a lot more speedily and rapidly than I thought. And that maybe even Ukraine will wind up contributing greatly to it. And we'll wind up with a freaking global conflict that puts sort of a coda to this shift, at the end of which, of course, we will be a shadow of our former self, we being the United States of America. Our physical situation right now seems to offer an exclamation point for that.
The Strait of Hormuz has long been considered a critical pressure point, in many ways almost like an economic weapon against both the United States and Israel. But today we saw something new emerging. Following Israeli strikes on Iran, reports came out from Yemen announcing that Israel would be denied access to the Red Sea corridor, effectively threatening to cut off key maritime routes. That immediately raises the stakes, because if the United States were to intervene militarily to challenge that blockade, it risks becoming directly involved in the escalation as well. And so we can already see how the escalation ladder is being constructed step by step. The question is, how does this actually play out in practice? What does it mean for Israel's long-term position, but also for the U.S. commitment to defend Israel under all circumstances? Right now, there doesn't seem to be a clear exit path. Some argue that Washington is trying to manage escalation, keeping ceasefires in place in certain areas while tensions continue elsewhere. But as each side responds, the risk is that the escalation becomes increasingly difficult to control. So the question is simple. Where does the United States go from here?
It is an interesting situation, apart from what I think is a building colossal disaster. It's an interesting situation, especially for someone like me who taught this at the Naval War College and the Marine Corps War College, and to a certain extent in two civilian universities, such as one can teach military matters to 18 and 19-year-old civilians. What we're looking at, in many respects, and that's why I say this is curiously interesting, is a reversal of 30 years of that teaching, at least in certain aspects. We were always worried, and I actually wrote a paper on this, all the key straits in the world, all the key narrow passageways in the world. And I included in that a couple of fjords. I included in that the Sea of Okhotsk, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, of course, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and others. And as I was doing this, I let a couple of papers come off for military consumption and postulated as to how these waterways, such as they were going to be used one day to teach the world a lesson. And predominantly what was taken out of that for wargaming and other things was that we could get into the Straits of Malacca, where at that time 65%, I think, of the traffic flowed through the Strait of Malacca in order to get to China or points east. And we did some computations on how much it would cost to go around and found out they weren't all that expensive trips, and that maybe the Strait of Malacca was not quite as essential as it seemed. It was just very convenient. It shaved a little money off and such. But some of the others were dramatic, and we postulated how we were going to put, I know you won't believe this, Marine Corps actually has adapted some of this, adopted some of it, adapted and adopted. We were going to put small units on these critical land masses, and those units would, because of technology and increased ability to, from a very small unit and a small space, control a vast area, especially of sea, control them, and thus choke off all our enemies whenever we went to war and that sort of thing. All to say that what has come out of this is really interesting to a person like me who was involved in that to the degree of detail I was, and how it's been used against us, and how in the future certain of these waterways might again be used against us and cut us off to the point where we are in the Caribbean and a Pacific coastline and an Atlantic coastline. The rest is verboten to us or highly dangerous to travel in. Could easily happen, and it certainly could happen if we start space-basing weapons and things like that, which is part of the Golden Dome deal. People aren't realizing what we're doing with this Golden Dome thing. All the money we're putting in it is not going to be wasted in terms of the people who want to militarize space. And you'll be able to control a lot of these points as you were on the shoulders of the water, so to speak, in my theory. You'll be able to control them from space. And you'll basically be able to control maritime traffic. All to say, look at what's happening in response to these kinds of prospects. What's happening, and it's not congealed yet in a real way, except perhaps with China and perhaps with Russia in a regional way. Everybody's going to pipelines and highways and rail. They're going back to the past in a certain respect. Pipelines, no. But yeah, even there, in a certain respect. Hell, I was painting Texas gas and oil pipelines when I was 16 years old. So we're going back to north, south, east, west pipelines. And we're getting away from the maritime environment because of all these things I just so inexpertly described, but also because space-based weapons are going to make it difficult. And you say, well, space-based weapons can hit pipelines too. Well, that's fine. You repair the pipeline. Pretty hard to get your ocean liner back out of the bottom of Davy Jones's locker or get the oil off the ocean surface. But these pipelines are going up everywhere. They're going up with a rapidity I never thought I would see. And yet I went with Powell to ExxonMobil's headquarters and looked at the pipelines pumping, pipelines contemplated, and pipelines under construction. And I said, and Powell agreed, future of the world. Right there, future of the world, ExxonMobil's map. And now that map is probably 10 times as dense with pipelines. And look at what MBS has just done, supposedly with his sovereign wealth fund investment in the pipeline that was going to run out of northern Saudi Arabia to Haifa, onto Ceyhan and onto Europe, and relieve some of the problems with Russian oil and so forth. That was the original plan. It isn't going through Haifa anymore because of what Israel has done. He's changed the plans. It's going through northern Syria. So that's just a tactical move, if you will, but it could become strategic. This is the future. This is the future, and what Russia and China are doing, in my view, Central Asia in particular, is recognizing that future and making their plans based on it. We're not. We're still stuck to the old regime.
This, in many ways, reflects an old geopolitical idea, the so-called Mackinder concept of building land-based transport corridors to reduce the dominance of maritime powers. And interestingly, we're starting to see similar dynamics in Europe. Just recently, the EU announced that its naval missions in the Mediterranean will be expanded to allow the boarding of what it calls shadow fleet tankers linked to Russia. But in a more multipolar world, this kind of approach becomes increasingly risky, because it is not a one-sided game anymore. Russia and other powers now have the ability to respond in kind, including through sanctions or even actions against Western shipping. So what was once a framework built on uncontested maritime dominance is now far more fragile. And as Eurasian powers develop strong land-based corridors, while Western economies remain heavily dependent on sea routes, these policies may prove counterproductive. In that sense, this could turn out to be a very risky development.
All it takes for that to evolve into, say, the slave trade across the Atlantic and what that bred in terms of piracy, that's all it takes. We'll have rogue fleets out there flying the high seas, picking off whatever targets they can pick off because there'll be no one to stop them.
At this point, it's going to be very difficult to put things back together after so much has already been broken. And I think that's one of the main flaws here.
As you intimated, it'll be a huge change in the pathways of global commerce. Because people won't want to ship globally. They won't want to do things globally. They'll want to do things internal to their landmass or whatever, or more safely and cheaper. Usually the arbiter, at least the way I read, what's his name's book, Frankopan's book about the new Silk Road, it's always cheaper to do it over land. I mean, you can say that as a maxim, and it might not be correct here, there, or wherever. But basically, it's always cheaper to do it over land.